Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel. Thank you so very much for joining me this evening, wherever you are in the world. And I do hope that you're incredibly well and that you've had the most marvellous day. I'm going to send each and every one of you loads of love. And don't forget to get that lovely cup of coffee or that cocoa, whatever it is that you drink, because I've got a lovely story for you. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do so. Click the notification bell and the thumbs up. And let's get started. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is McGregor and I was a sheriff for a small rural town in North America in the early 80s. And my Bigfoot encounter happened in 1987. I'd like to remain anonymous for the purposes of this story, as I most certainly never discussed these strange occurrences with anybody else in the force. Some of the stories sounded too crazy to be possibly true. And the last thing you need in the force is your credibility to be compromised, tarnished and subsequently left in tatters like confetti after a wedding. When that happens, invariably bang goes your career in the force, not to mention your esteemed, hard-earned reputation from years of dedicated work. So mentioning things that border on the paranormal or the fictitious is certainly not a good idea for someone in my position. I'm quite sure there are others exactly like me in the force who've experienced strange phenomenon, but I am in no doubt that they would keep their mouths shut, and rightly so. If someone were to tell me the same stories that I'm about to tell you and your listeners in this anonymous forum, in truth I would think they were barking mad, or they'd lost their marbles. The trouble is, when you've experienced the unexplainable yourself, it is almost impossible to fathom what you've actually seen. You almost always assume that you're going mad, or you've just been dreaming, because it really takes a huge paradigm shift to begin to appreciate that these things going on in the world that defy rational explanation do actually exist and are real, even though they may appear spurious. All my life I've lived in a small rustic rural town where all the locals were warm and friendly and everyone knew everyone. There was a great community spirit, and that is something that you can't get in a big city. There were several streets in our rural area that could almost pass for being suburban, although they weren't, as all the symmetrical Mediterranean-style houses were painted in bright colours like yellows, greens, blues, pinks and apricots. Most of the houses were very spacious and large, with wooden framed windows and glamorous front doors. Every house possessed a generous-sized backyard, entertainment area and swimming pool, and they were quite literally nestled away in the heart of the exquisite countryside. Everyone in the local area tended to take pride in the outdoor appearance of their homes, and during the summer and spring the front yards were filled with a kaleidoscope of pretty colours, from seasonal flowers, abundant roses and pretty shrubbery. Most of the houses overlooked ravishing views over rugged mountainous outcrops, rolling emerald green valleys, pasture land for horses and cows, meadows, and acre upon acre of ubiquitous resplendent forest that literally stretched back for miles, that was filled with towering oaks, maples, pines and spruce trees that were teeming with the indigenous wildlife in the area. It was not uncommon to find deer and even the odd bear frolicking around the garden, and provided they did not eat all our seasonal annuals, we enjoyed our little visitors. Although there were occasions when some of our vegetables and fruit would go missing from our yards, but it was a small price to pay for the pleasure of enjoying the odd furry visitor. I lived in the local neighbourhood myself, in an apricot-coloured symmetrical designed house that possessed a green roof and green wooden windows and green shutters and a large wraparound porch. Our house was flanked at the back with a large area of natural forest that stretched back for many miles. Even though I had a sheriff's office in the local town, as a small town I was pretty much on duty all the time, even when I was off duty, so to speak, if you get my drift. People could literally call me day or night at any time or hour if they were experiencing any kind of trouble. But living in a small town where crime was very much unheard of, you would think that I found my job tediously boring, but not so. On the contrary, being a sheriff was much more exciting and colourful job than you could ever imagine, because I got to know some interesting, curious people in the community very well indeed. And believe me, we had some remarkable characters in our neck of the wood that brightened the dullest day. Of that I can assure you. And if I had all day, I would have some funny stories to reveal to you. but another time perhaps. One evening I was having dinner with my wife Anna and our daughter Isabella when I received a very urgent phone call from an elderly lady in our neighbourhood called Alice. At the best of times, Alice was a dramatic character that would always make a mountain out of a molehill out of the most ordinary situations. I'd been called out to her house when there was a big rat in her backyard and she was so terrified, and when there was a dead cat lying close to her driveway. She just couldn't cope with situations like that. So I pretty much expected that that was what this call was about. I could tell that she was in a dreadful state on the telephone, and to be honest, I'd never heard her sound this flustered or paranoid before. "Get here now," she cried. "I've never been so frightened in all my life." I remembered excusing myself from the dinner table and kissing my wife and daughter on the cheek and sighing to myself as I reluctantly got into the car. I was almost certain that Alice had just seen another rat in her kitchen and was having a panic attack about it, and invariably she was going to need me to kill it for her and remove it from her home. When I arrived at her house, she ushered me in very quickly, and she looked over her shoulder in concern, as if she was afraid of something or someone in her yard. "Everything all right, Alice?" I asked. "You look as if you've seen a ghost." "Shh," she said. "They might come back. They might come back." "Who might come back, Alice?" I asked. "The devil's children," she whispered. "The devil's children." "Sorry, Alice, you've lost me. What on earth are you talking about?" Alice's eyes were as wide as saucers, and she was physically shaking, and I realised I'd never ever seen her this distressed before. And I knew at once that something really insidious and quite awful had just transpired. "About 20 minutes ago," said Alice, stammering, "two menacing-looking children were knocking at my door. When I opened the door, the kids were standing there, telling me to let them in. But by the way they spoke, it was so mechanical, like a robot. But their eyes, they were just completely black, and I could feel this nefarious evil around them. I've never, ever sensed anything like that before. Immediately I slammed the door in their faces, and they continued to knock, and they kept saying, 'Let us in! Let us in!' I've never been that afraid in all my life. Sheriff, those children were not children. I promise you that. When I would not come to the door, they were literally screaming at the top of their lungs, 'Let us in! Let us in!' like that. And they were hammering my door with their fists so hard that the door actually shook under the vibration. But I'm glad to say they appear to have gone now. But supposing they come back, Sheriff," she said, looking at me with terror in her eyes. "I don't know what I will do if they come back, Sheriff." "I'm sure they won't be coming back, Alice," I said. "Maybe those kids were just trying to scare you, having a bit of fun. You know what kids are like." "Sheriff, those kids were not kids. They were the devil's children. They were not human." I didn't know what to make of Alice's peculiar story, as it seemed so incredibly far-fetched, but I did my very best to reassure her. Suddenly her phone rang, and after she answered it, she handed it to me. "I think it's for you. Someone else is having problems." I imagine my wife had informed the caller to call me at Alice's home, as in those days we didn't have the convenience of cell phones. "Hello, Sheriff. Is that you?" "Yes, it is," I answered. "Who is this?" "It's Jenny Jones from number 22. "Oh, hello, Jenny. What's up?" I asked. "You do sound rather alarmed. Is everything all right?" "Sheriff, something quite dreadful has happened. I don't know what to do," she cried out in distress. "What's wrong, Jenny? What's happened?" I asked. "There were these horrible, horrible children knocking at my door, Sheriff. Quite the most ghastly children that I've ever had the misfortune to meet. There were two of them, a girl and a boy, of about 10 years old. And even the clothes they were wearing, Sheriff, they weren't typical of kids their own age. They were made of a very odd-looking material, and even a weird style and design. When I opened the door, they asked me to let them in because they said they were hungry. Sheriff, those kids were not kids, nor were they hungry. Their eye sockets were totally black. And Sheriff, when I say black, I mean the darkest, most black that you could ever imagine, as black as coal. And they had no irises in their eyes and absolutely no whites. Also, Sheriff, their soulless, monotonous voices sounded weird and automatic and machine-like. I could not let them in, Sheriff. I don't know where they came from, but they are incredibly demonical. You could sense it. It was that palpable. I couldn't let them in, Sheriff, as I said. I couldn't. I shut the door in their faces, and they are at my door right now, Sheriff, screaming like satanical banshees, ordering me to invite them in. Please get here now, Sheriff. Please, I beg you. I don't know what I'm going to do if you don't. I immediately left Alice's house and drove straight to Jenny Jones's, which wasn't far away. Then I saw them. I saw these two children hammering at the door, and their backs were turned away from me. But the way those kids were pounding that front door was not normal behaviour for a child. There's no way that a kid could lash out as violently and aggressively as these kids did, and their fists seemed almost too powerful for a child's fists, because they were hammering that door with such brute force. It would not be physically possible for a kid to hit that hard, I can assure you of that. I ran towards the door, and the malevolent kids turned around to stare at me, and I promise you these unsavoury children were definitely not human. Alice was right about that. Nor were they children, even though they appeared to be. They were insidiously evil, and their odorous eyes were like large pools of black water, and when they stared at me, it put the fear of God into every fibre of my being, and I'm not exaggerating. I remember my hair stood on end, and my heart was literally pounding at 1,000 miles an hour. You tell me any kids can do that to you, because I don't know of any. I was terrified by these iniquitous children that were definitely not children. I'm certain of that. I told the children to get out and to go away, and that they were not welcome in our town. "Arrest us, Sheriff," said the boy. "Invite us in to your station." I knew at once that these kids wanted to be invited into our homes, even arrested. They wanted that invitation. I realised that if they were not invited, they would endeavour to manipulate us to invite them in, so I challenged them. I said, "Whatever or whoever you are not children, and no one in our town will invite you into their homes. You are diabolically evil, and you are concealing yourself in a childlike disguise that I don't buy for a minute, and you haven't fooled me, so get out of our town at once." Those two children looked startled and amazed by my words. Something shifted because the words I spoke were so powerful and efficacious, as if those kids were clearly wearing some kind of holographic disguise, which almost disintegrated before my very eyes, much to my amazement, almost melting away like chocolate. This fake hologram, which is what I think it was, started making a very curious buzzing sound, like a television that goes on the blink or loses connection. And I noticed their faces became blurred and fuzzy, but amidst this murky haze, I'm convinced I got a glimpse of a grey alien. But you always second-guess yourself, so I'm not quite sure if I'm right, and I could be mistaken by what I think I saw, because that's what it is, that's what I thought I saw. The kids began to run away from me as fast as they possibly could, because I think they didn't want me to see who they really were. And then they vanished and almost disappeared, and I've no idea where they went, but I didn't care as long as I never ever saw them again, because they were that diabolical. It was a very bizarre experience for me, one that I will never be able to make any sense of at all. Meeting those evil children was one experience of a lifetime that I cannot forget, and I think anyone else who had an encounter with them would feel that way too. I do know that the residents that encountered those duplicitous children suffered tremendous anxieties for years after the harrowing event. In the days that followed, there were incredible reports of strange anonymous lights seen floating over the forest area, and a strange buzzing sound like a loud generator was reported by many residents in the area, who described the sound as very mechanical and exceedingly unsettling, and the noise went on for about 45 long minutes. Even more extraordinary was that one of the locals found a large circular burnt-out area in a wooded clearing while he was out walking his dogs in the woods. It was quite literally a cookie-cutter size of a colossal flying saucer that was burnt out in the grass. It was all very peculiar, and nobody knew what to make of it. Was this connected to the black-eyed children, I don't know, but I do know that they want you to invite them in, and when you do that, I'm almost certain that something very nefarious and very awful will happen to you. As Alice so eloquently put it, those are the devil's children, and I wholeheartedly agree, because there is no other way to describe them. Are those black-eyed children connected to grey aliens? I believe they are, but I guess that subject is open for debate. One day I got a call from a frantic resident to tell us that her son Stephen had gone missing in the woods, and he had been playing with his brother Philip, and then he just vanished during their game, and Philip didn't know where on earth he'd gone. Philip was in a dreadful commotion because his brother had vanished before his very eyes, and his mother was hysterical. We set out with a large search party to look for Philip, but we couldn't find him anywhere for 3 long days, and he was registered as missing and presumed dead. 3 days later he suddenly appeared from absolutely nowhere, and he had an extraordinary story to account. I had no reason to doubt that at the time he begged me not to tell anyone his amazing story, for fear of being disbelieved or ridiculed, and this was his account, as he described it to me. My brother and I were playing in the woods using our slingshots. I quickly ran to a section of the woods to relieve myself, and I remember losing my balance, slipping and then somersaulting down this large hollow opening in the ground that was covered and concealed by dense overgrown shrubbery that you would never have known was there unless you'd actually seen it. It may have been part of an old mine shaft, I'm not sure. I must have hit my head really badly because it was throbbing violently and bleeding profusely. I do remember drifting in and out of consciousness. I also vaguely recall that Stephen was calling out for me, but I tried to answer him, and then I think I lost consciousness all over again, because everything after that went blank. I must have blacked out for a long while, how long I have no idea, but I do remember waking up and stirring very slowly and finding myself in this strange hollow, and everything was very foggy and blurry and confusing for me at the time. I was disorientated and very muddled. It was like I'd lost my short-term memory for a while. I couldn't understand how I'd got into this hollow, nor could I remember how I'd got here in the first place. I tried to climb out of this mine, but it was too deep for me to get out of it, so I was stuck there, and I kept calling out for help, but no one came to my rescue, and no one heard my desperate calls, and I screamed out for a very long time until I was completely hoarse and had almost lost my voice. I became very distraught and frightened because I was all alone in this dark shaft. My head was still hurting, but my memory did come flooding back finally, and I suddenly remembered my fall and how I'd ended up in this deep hollow in the first place. I felt hungry and thirsty and tired, and my dry mouth was parched because I was so thirsty. I was longing for a drink. I kept holding on to the vain hope that my family would come looking for me, so I called out again and again, but no one was answering my calls. I felt horribly alone, and quite frightened, to be truthful. Suddenly I saw this humongous hand pull back the undergrowth like a curtain and tear it away. And then I saw this huge cone-shaped face peering down at me with an agog look on its hairless, leathery face. It looked shocked and surprised, but the face was so human, and yet it wasn't human at the same time. What on earth was this strange creature, I was wondering to myself, because it was unlike anything I'd ever seen. It had a very distinct brow ridge, a flat nose, a slender mouth, and a very deep-set, treacle-coloured pair of eyes that were actually quite warm and friendly, if I say so myself. I wanted to scream because for a moment I felt like a deer that was ensnared in a lion's den, and that this dangerous apex predator was staring at me as if I was a quick, easy, appetizing snack. But I did realise by the look that this clearly wasn't the case. The creature wasn't at all aggressive, but seemed amused to see me caught up in the old mine shaft, and if I didn't know any better, I could swear it was chuckling and laughing at me. I noticed the creature's eyes were incredibly warm, friendly and kind, without an ounce of animosity, so I immediately lost my fear and relaxed. I did try to ask the creature for help by explaining that I was stuck in this mine shaft. Suddenly the creature jumped down to the area where I was sitting, and he landed at the bottom of the shaft, literally with the agility of a domestic cat. He had no problems landing on the ground. I was fascinated and realised that the creature had heavily padded human-like feet, with a slightly angled large toe, and the feet were very human but humongous. I noticed also that the creature was agile and graceful, although very colossal in size, much bigger than a black bear. I would say she was about 9 foot tall, 900 pounds and 4 foot wide, and she was covered with long flowing auburn hair that I remember thinking to myself was a particularly beautiful colour. I noticed her breasts were covered in hair, and her overlong arms hung well below her knees, so I imagined she could run very easily on all fours, as easily as on 2 feet. I also noticed that her physique was incredibly powerful, very impressive and strong, especially her colossal shoulders that were very gargantuan. The creature grabbed a huge stone, and with it she hammered into the side of the rocky miney shaft with such brute strength that she was able to make some large footholds in the wall. For a human to attempt to do that would have been very difficult, but for her it was with effortless ease. A human would have had to use a very powerful axe, or something probably electronic. As she made the footholds in the wall, she would perch on one foothold while effortlessly balancing her whole body on one foot, while she used the stone to make a series of footholds several feet apart until it reached the opening of the shaft. She picked me up in her arms and placed me over her shoulders as if I weighed absolutely nothing, and before I knew it I was lifted out of the shaft. How she did it I have no idea, but she was so quick and efficient. She then placed me on the ground and made a few chattering sounds, and then like grease lightning she disappeared into the forest, leaving me there. I could not believe that this creature had helped me like this. She was beautiful, majestic and lofty, and quite literally had saved my life, because I do not know if I would have ever been found in that mine shaft if she had not answered my frantic calls, so I am so grateful that she did. After my experience with the black-eyed kids, I was not dismissive of this boy's claims, but I told him that he was never to tell anybody about what had happened, because I knew that there were people out there in our community who would not believe his story and would laugh at him, and I knew, even though I knew his story was true. One evening when I was called out to a family who swore they'd seen a dark shadow loitering around in their backyard, and they were afraid, and had heard a strange noise that they described as a series of whooping sounds. As I parked my car, I went straight to the family's backyard with my flashlight to see if I could investigate that black shadow they'd been talking about. Suddenly I heard this whooping sound, and then I saw this small 3-foot creature covered in auburn hair that looked absolutely terrified to see me, and it quickly ran away, shimmering up an oak tree in the yard, trying to hide. Suddenly I heard a very distinct whooping sound, and then the little creature was looking at me through the trees in a worrisome way, but then it decided to rush down the tree like a fireman on his pole, and it thundered past me at 1,000 miles an hour like a rhino, and it raced towards a tall figure covered in auburn hair that fitted the boy's description perfectly of the strange creature that had rescued him from the mine shaft. I think this could have been the one creature that had saved him. I got the impression that the little one had got lost and called out to his mother for help with those strange whooping sounds. The little hairy humanoid creature whimpered in delight to see his mother, and jumped on her back, and off they went. For a second she looked at me with her treacle-coloured eyes. I remember thinking, wow, you're magnificent, whatever you are, because the creature was majestic, lofty, powerful and beautiful, and when she moved she was so graceful and as fast as a cheetah. I was so in awe of her. "Did you see anything, Sheriff?" asked the resident in the house. "Did you see that black shadow?" "No," I lied. "There's nothing in your yard. You're perfectly safe." All these years later I reflect on the creature that I saw, and after all the publicity about Bigfoot, I was to learn what the creature was that I encountered all those years ago, and the creature that rescued the young boy from the mine shaft. I also learnt that I'm not alone in my strange experiences with those black-eyed children. Well, I just want to thank you so very much for that incredible encounter. And I must say, and anybody listening, if you've had an encounter with a black-eyed child, please do let us know, because everybody's fascinated about this story. And what do you think these black-eyed children are? Do you think that they actually are grey aliens, like the sheriff seems to think? What do you think about the fact that the creature, these children appeared to kind of almost be holographic? What's your opinion on that? So do let us know. And what about the fact that those kids were also wearing very strange, unusual material that appeared to be out of worldly? I'd be interested to know what you think. Until next time, goodbye and good night.